He screamed so loud during his own trials that sound engineers had to physically lower the sensitivity of their microphones just to record the defendants' answers. He sentenced more than 5,000 people to death, more than every other Nazi court session combined across 11 years. He stripped generals of their belts, dressed field marshals in oversized rags, and mocked them in front of cameras, all while wearing a blood-red robe beneath a giant sculpted bust of Adolf Hitler. His name was Roland Freisler, and he wasn't a soldier, he wasn't an SS officer, he wasn't a camp commander. He was a judge. And when his moment of reckoning finally arrived on the morning of February 3rd, 1945, it didn't come from an executioner's blade or a firing squad. It came from the sky. Before we go any further, if you're new to War Heroes, this channel exists to tell the stories history books leave out, the ones that are hard to watch, impossible to forget, and absolutely necessary to understand. Hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell, because every single week we uncover the darkest, most gripping chapters of World War II that most channels won't touch. Now let's get into it. Roland Freisler was born on October 30th, 1893, in Celle, Germany, the son of an engineer named Julius Freisler and his wife Charlotte. By every early measure, he appeared to be exactly what his family hoped: disciplined, sharp, and academically gifted. He and his two brothers were raised as Protestants, baptized into a faith that would later stand in complete contradiction to everything he became. When World War I broke out on July 28, 1914, Freisler was studying law at the University of Jena. He interrupted his studies, enlisted as an officer cadet in the German army, and by 1915 had risen to the rank of lieutenant. He was even awarded the Iron Cross Second Class for gallantry in combat. Then came the moment that would quietly shape everything. In October 1915, Freisler was captured by Russian forces on the Eastern Front and imprisoned in an officers' camp near Moscow. While most prisoners counted the days until liberation, Freisler did something unusual. He stayed in Soviet Russia voluntarily until 1919, a full year after his fellow prisoners had been released and sent home. During that time, he became fluent in Russian, and by most historical accounts, he became a committed Bolshevik. Think about that for a second. The man who would one day scream Nazi ideology at defendants in a Berlin courtroom once sat in a Soviet prison camp and embraced communist revolution. He returned to Germany in 1919, finished his law degree at the University of Jena, and earned his doctorate in law in 1922. 6 years after nearly dying on the Eastern Front, Roland Freisler had transformed himself into a qualified attorney and was looking for a political home. He found it in July 1925 when he joined the Nazi Party. Freisler didn't just join, he attacked. He immediately used his legal training to defend Nazi members who were being prosecuted for political violence, building a reputation as an aggressive, theatrical, and utterly ruthless courtroom operator. Even in those early years, colleagues noticed something unsettling about him. Well, now, a 1927 assessment by fellow Nazi Karl Weinrich put it bluntly: rhetorically, Freisler is equal to our best speakers, if not superior, but thinking people mostly reject him. He is unsuitable for any position of authority because of his unreliability and moodiness. He was warned about. He was documented as dangerous, and yet he kept rising. On March 24, 1928, Freisler married Marion Russiger. The couple had 2 sons. By all outward appearances, he was a family man, a husband and a father. But behind closed doors, he was already drafting legal arguments for racial segregation. When Hitler came to power in January 1933, Freisler's career exploded. He became a member of the Reichstag, Germany's parliament. He was appointed ministerial director in the Prussian Ministry of Justice and Secretary of State in both the Prussian and Reich Ministries of Justice simultaneously. He also helped draft the ideological architecture for Nazi racial law. In 1933, he published a pamphlet demanding the legal prohibition of what the Nazis called mixed blood sexual intercourse. 2 years later, in September 1935, the Nuremberg Laws were announced, stripping Jews of citizenship and banning intermarriage. Freisler had been building the legal framework for those laws for years. He was never just a judge. He was an architect of genocide. On August 20th, 1942, Adolf Hitler appointed Freisler president of the Volksgerichtshof, the People's Court. This was not a court in any recognizable legal sense. There were no fair trials. There were no impartial juries. The verdicts were decided before defendants ever walked through the door. Approximately 90% of all cases before Freisler ended in guilty verdicts, and between 1942 and 1945, he personally decreed more than 5,000 death sentences. His 3 years on that bench produced as many executions as all other sessions of the court combined across its entire 11-year history. The courtroom itself was designed as theater. Freisler sat beneath enormous red swastika-draped banners and a towering black-sculpted bust of Hitler. He wore a blood-scarlet judicial robe and opened every session with a Nazi salute from the bench. He acted as prosecutor, judge, and executioner in one body. He screamed at defendants, interrupted their answers, mocked their families, and made a deliberate show of reducing human beings to objects. The Nazis dressed defendants in old, oversized, beltless clothing on purpose, so that as they stood before the court, they were forced to constantly hold up their own trousers with their hands. It was calculated humiliation, broadcast to the German public in cinema newsreels. Freisler himself once described his vision for the court in chilling terms. He said he wanted to judge as the Führer himself would judge the case. In February 1943, a 21-year-old university student named Sophie Scholl was caught distributing anti-Nazi leaflets at the Ludwig Maximilian University in Munich. She and her brother Hans were members of a resistance group called the White Rose, young Germans who were writing and secretly distributing pamphlets calling on their fellow citizens to resist Hitler, acknowledge the mass murder of Poles, and demand an end to the war. They were arrested and interrogated by the Gestapo. During interrogation, Sophie was offered a reduced sentence if she would simply say that Hans had led her astray. She refused. She looked her captors in the eye and said, "I won't betray my brother or my principles. I'll make no bargain with the Nazis." Freisler was flown into Munich specifically to preside over their trial. When Sophie stood before him in that courtroom, she didn't flinch. She looked directly at the man who held her life in his hands and told him, "Somebody, after all, had to make a start. What we wrote and said is also believed by many others. They just don't dare express themselves as we did." Then she interrupted him, the most feared judge in Nazi Germany, and said, "You know the war is lost. Why don't you have the courage to face it?" The trial lasted half a day. The verdict was predetermined. Guilty. Freisler sentenced them to death. And on that same afternoon, Hans and Sophie Scholl, along with their friend Christoph Probst, were taken to Stadelheim prison and executed by guillotine. Sophie was 21 years old. On July 20th, 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg placed a bomb inside Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters at Rastenburg, East Prussia. The explosion ripped through the conference room. Hitler survived. What followed was the most massive manhunt in the history of the Third Reich. More than 7,000 people were arrested. Hitler ordered that those found guilty should be hanged like cattle. Freisler was handed the trials of the conspirators, and he turned them into something grotesque. The proceedings were filmed for propaganda, and the footage that survived shows exactly what kind of man Roland Freisler was. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben stood before him in deliberately oversized, beltless clothing, struggling to hold his trousers up. Freisler sneered from the bench, "You dirty old man, why do you keep fiddling with your trousers?" But von Witzleben didn't break. His final words to Freisler were, "You can hand us over to the executioner. In 3 months, the outraged and tormented people will hold you accountable and drag you alive through the mud of the streets." Caesar von Hoffacker, one of the resistance leaders in France, was repeatedly interrupted by Freisler during his testimony. He stopped, looked Freisler dead in the eyes and said, "You are silent now, Herr Freisler, because today it is about my head. In a year it will be about yours." General Erich Feldgiebel, when Freisler sadistically described his impending death, simply told him, "Then hurry up, Mr. President, otherwise you'll hang before we do." These men were days away from execution, and they were the ones making the judge flinch. In the end, 4,980 people connected to the July plot were executed, often within 2 hours of the verdict being read. Some were hanged on meat hooks with piano wire. The executions filmed at Hitler's personal request. The morning of February 3rd, 1945. Freisler was conducting a Saturday session of the People's Court when the air raid sirens began to scream across Berlin. It was the United States Army Air Forces. Hundreds of bombers turning the Nazi capital into fire and rubble, killing over 20,000 people in a single raid. Government buildings fell. The Gestapo headquarters was hit. The Reich Chancellery took damage. And the People's Court, Freisler's own kingdom of terror, was struck directly. Freisler ordered the prisoners before him taken to an air raid shelter, but he himself stayed behind. He stayed to gather his files. At 11:08 in the morning, a bomb hit the court building. The structure partially collapsed, and as Freisler stood distracted, clutching his documents, a massive masonry column came loose from the ceiling and came crashing down on him. He was killed instantly. The collapse brought more of the courtroom down on top of his body. When rescue workers found him, his crushed and flattened remains were still gripping the files he had refused to leave behind. A second account states that Freisler was struck by a bomb fragment while trying to escape to the shelter and bled to death on the pavement outside the very building where he had condemned thousands to die. His body was taken to the Lützow hospital. When a hospital worker saw who had been brought in, she said quietly, "It is God's verdict." Not one person in that room replied. Roland Freisler was buried in his wife's family grave in Berlin. His name is not recorded on the tombstone. The man who had screamed the names of thousands in condemnation died nameless in the rubble of his own court. Caesar von Hofacker's prediction had come true in less than a year. History doesn't always deliver justice, but sometimes, just sometimes, it does. Roland Freisler spent 3 years turning a courtroom into a slaughterhouse. He screamed at the innocent, mocked the brave, and sentenced over 5,000 human beings to death with the full armor of Nazi law behind him. And in the end, he died alone, clutching paperwork beneath the very institution he built. The defendants he humiliated faced death with more courage and dignity than he ever showed behind that bench. That is the story of war heroes. Not just the men who led armies, but the ordinary people who stood up against monsters, and the monsters themselves who forgot that history never stops watching. If this video hit different, subscribe to War Heroes right now. Every week we go deeper into the stories, the people, and the moments that define the Second World War. Hit the like button, drop a comment with what shocked you most about Freisler's story, and share this video with someone who needs to know this history. We'll see you in the next one.